Since time began, the dead alone know peace. Life is but melting snow. Hi guys, I'm Richard Various, and this is episode 4 of Various Things. This is a weekly short format podcast about anything and everything. The poem at the beginning of the episode is by the Zen monk Nandai, and it's an example of death poetry. Nandai wrote this poem on his deathbed, shortly before passing away. A death poem is a poem written by an author who's on the verge of death, and the purpose of the poem is to offer an insight into the nature of death from the perspective of someone who has nothing to lose. Death poetry developed in the literary traditions of East Asian cultures, predominantly in Japan and to a lesser degree in China and Korea as well. Death poetry draws its structure from universal Buddhist themes, but it's mainly practiced by followers of Zen Buddhist traditions. Writing for the Japan Times, American author Eugene Thacker describes the changeable form of the death poem in an article that I'll link to in the show notes. He writes that most death poems follow either a haiku or slightly longer tanka poetic form, but that some poems aren't poems at all. The 17th century poet Takuan Soho, for example, simply wrote the character for Dream in his final moments. More enigmatic still was the death poem of 18th century Zen monk Shisui. On his deathbed, Shisui's disciples asked him to write a death poem, to which he responded by grasping a brush, painting a Zen circle, and then throwing the brush aside and dying. Here's another example. This time it's by 14th century Zen master Kozan Ichikyo. Empty-handed I entered the world, barefoot I leave it. My coming, my going, two simple happenings that got entangled. The story goes that Kozan finished writing the poem and then died while sitting upright. One thing we can see in Kozan's poem is a quality shared by almost all death poems, which is an attempt to convey the truth of what Buddhists call the 3 marks of existence. The 3 marks of existence are these. Number 1, the material world is impermanent. Number 2, attachment to the material world causes suffering. And number 3, reality is the absence of the self. So I was thinking about what makes death poetry so enigmatic, in a way that so clearly differs from what we've inherited here in the West. The closest thing we can compare death poetry to is the practice of recording people's last words, but the similarities are relatively few. In the West, it's not unusual to look to a person's final words as a summation of who they were, their achievements or their final wishes. A good example comes from Queen Elizabeth I, who's said to have remarked prior to her death in 1603, quote, "All my possessions for a moment of time." All my possessions for a moment of time. In this we see a kind of tragedy and heroism that we don't get from the death poem. The Virgin Queen refuses to accept death and attempts to bargain for more life. And it isn't an insignificant offer either. She is the Queen of England after all, and the irony is not lost by any means. In her final words, we can clearly see the difference between the Western idea of final words and the Eastern practice of death poetry. Final words tend to culminate the life of the individual in a way that preserves that life after the person has died. Death poetry, on the other hand, seeks to preempt death by annihilating the subjectivity of the author beforehand. Compare Elizabeth's final words, "All my possessions for a moment of time," to the death poem of Kozan Ichikyo that I read earlier. It's only brief, so I'll read it again. Empty-handed I entered the world, barefoot I leave it. My coming, my going, two simple happenings that got entangled. I don't think you could get 2 more starkly contrasting reactions to death than these 2 examples. Kozan sees what's happening and responds by dissolving himself, by emptying himself out. Elizabeth reacts by bargaining for more life. The end is identical in both cases. Kozan and Elizabeth obviously die, But I think Corzan's death poem communicates something about the nature of death, which I think hits the mark more accurately than Elizabeth's final words. To be sure, Elizabeth wasn't the first person to try to bargain with death, and she certainly wasn't the last. What she communicates is very true about the subjective experience of dying. But Corzan, by denying his own subjectivity, encompasses more than the subjective experience per se. He says something about the objective truth of the event. That is, that he will die, and the world will go on without him. And in saying that, he forces our own realization that the same will be true of us when it's our time to go. I think that it's this realization that makes the death poem and the practices surrounding it so fascinating. There's a distilled, nothing-to-gain honesty that tears away our illusions, if only for a fraction of a second, and allows us to glimpse something greater than ourselves. I'm keen to hear what you think about the practice of writing death poetry, and whether you agree with what I've said this week, so let me know in the comments. I'll link to all the articles that I've mentioned this week in the show notes on our Patreon page, and I'll include a bunch of other links as well. If you've enjoyed this week's episode and you want to support the podcast, check it out. There are great rewards for patrons, like access to exclusive content, extended patron-only episodes, and more. And you can support the podcast from as little as $2 a month. This week, I'll be including some additional audio of me reading and talking about death poems and Zen poetry generally. You can find us at patreon.com/various things. So until next time, this is Richard Various, and this has been Various Things. Bye for now.